He was an ordinary ranger who patrolled his section of the desert every day. But one day, his attention was drawn to a massive tree. There was something strange on its trunk, almost alive. Dot. As he got closer, he realized it wasn't just a nest dot. What he saw inside changed his life forever. Dot. Subscribe to the channel and make sure to comment where you're watching this video from. The first light of dawn spilled across the vast Namibian horizon, stretching like a faded watercolor across a land made of dust, rock, and silence. Ranger Jalen Brooks rose before the sun, as he did every morning. He lived by rhythm, not by alarm, by the call of the francolins, by the cooling of the air before dawn, by the way the world shifted from deep indigo to the color of fire. His station, a rusting field cabin built from sheet metal and timber, stood on a low rise near the edge of the Etosha fringe. Around him, the land was ancient, worn flat by time, where each shadow belonged to something alive and wary. Inside, the cabin smelled of dry dust and old oil. On the wall hung a faded topographic map, scarred by thumbtacks and pencil circles. One corner marked a square of emptiness. The northern sector, a stretch of scrubland the others had long avoided. Animals no longer passed through it. Even the vultures, with their savage patience, seemed to turn away mid-flight. Jalen had noticed that emptiness months ago when he began logging sightings for the season. Columns of numbers, timestamps, and coordinates told a story the eye could not ignore. One of silence growing where there should have been sound. He dressed slowly, the way men do when routine has replaced thought. Khaki shirt, sun-bleached trousers, worn leather boots, the wide-brimmed hat that had molded itself to his head over the years. His binoculars hung around his neck, their rubber eye cups cracked from years of use. He poured himself a tin cup of black coffee, its bitterness steadying his pulse. There was something calming about knowing that nothing in this landscape could be rushed. He walked outside and stood by the metal railing, scanning the plain. The morning air shimmered, still cool from the night. The scent of dry acacia pods hung in the air. A herd of springbok flickered in the distance, their white rumps flashing like tiny mirrors as they moved toward the eastern watering hole. Beyond them lay the horizon, flat, endless, and deceptive. Out here, distance lied. What looked an hour away could take half a day to reach. Jalen was a man of quiet discipline. He wrote in his field journal daily, kept his tools clean, and maintained the habit of speaking little even when company arrived. The wilderness had burned away everything unnecessary: words, impatience, vanity. What remained was a man attuned to patterns. To him, the bush was a language, one written in prints and shadows and the faintest differences of sound. He knew when a lioness had passed by the depth of a paw mark, when rain had fallen by the faint crust that formed on the sand. That morning, however, the land seemed off-tempo. He felt it in the hush between the bird calls, in the way the light trembled without warmth. The wind that usually carried the sweet dry scent of grass came from the north, heavy and metallic. He stood still for a long while, listening. Even silence, when you know it well enough, can make a sound. He turned toward his truck, an old Land Cruiser with the color of desert clay. It rattled and coughed when he started it, as if waking from a deep sleep. On the passenger seat sat his GPS, a canteen of water, his camera, and a faded notebook labeled Incident Reports, 2021 present. He always carried that book. Within it were notes of animal sightings, poaching tracks, and weather data, but also his private ledger of things that didn't make sense. A week earlier, he had recorded a strange observation. On the northeast ridge, a large patch of ground appeared darker in satellite view, ringed like a bruise. He suspected brush fire, but when he drove there, the soil was sterile, not burned, but as if something had leached it of life. No ants, no burrows, no grass tufts. The locals said the spirits slept there, but Jalen was not a man of superstition. Yet he couldn't shake the unease that settled in his stomach each time he thought of that place. He drove off just as the sun rose in full force. Heat bled quickly from the horizon, and soon the truck's interior turned into an oven. Dust trailed behind him like a fading ghost. He drove slowly, keeping his eyes on the road and the land around it. The silence persisted. Even the jackals, those tireless wanderers of the morning, were absent. Only the tires rolling over gravel filled the air. By mid-morning, he reached the dry riverbed that marked the start of the no-go zone. He parked under a low thorn tree and stepped out. His boots crunched on brittle earth. He took out his binoculars, scanning the expanse ahead. It looked empty. Nothing but scrub and pale grass, but something in the pattern of the light caught his attention. To the north, about 5 kilometers away, stood a lone tree, larger than the others, its canopy unusually dense. At first, he thought it was just shadow. Then he realized the crown was bulging downward, heavy, as if something enormous clung to its branches. It looked like a dark, sagging cloud caught in the thorns. Jalen adjusted the focus. The image sharpened, and what he saw made his throat tighten. It wasn't shadow. It was a mass of dry grass, sticks, and debris woven so thickly it nearly obscured the trunk. He had seen weaver-bird nests before, ingenious communal structures that sometimes grew large enough to house hundreds, but never anything of that magnitude. This was a fortress, a city built by small minds with relentless persistence. The weight of it seemed impossible for the thin acacia branches to bear. He lowered the binoculars, staring at the horizon. For a moment, the idea of approaching it tugged at him like a lure, but another thought, older, colder, rose to meet it. That area wasn't just abandoned by animals. There had been reports years ago of unmarked construction sites and unexplained ground collapses. The park's oldest employees still whispered about an incident during the 70s, when a convoy of trucks vanished near that region. It was all rumor now, half forgotten under bureaucracy and time. But Jalen trusted the land more than paper records, and the land was uneasy. He decided to mark the coordinates and return the next morning. It was a professional instinct. Observe before you interfere. Still, as he jotted down the numbers in his notebook, he realized his hands had gone cold despite the heat. The air smelled faintly of iron, like blood on hot metal. Driving back toward his cabin, he passed the old watchtower where his late partner Daniel had once worked. The rusting structure rose against the sky like a skeleton, its ladder missing a few rungs. Daniel's death had been a quiet wound. A poacher's trap, hidden under dust, had taken his leg. Infection had done the rest. Jalen had found him too late. Ever since, he had made a private vow, never to ignore the signs the land offered. The bush spoke, always. It was men who refused to listen. That night, the wind came again from the north. It rattled the tin walls of his cabin and carried with it the faintest hum, a vibration more felt than heard. Jalen sat by the window, his lamp burning low, staring out into the darkness. The tree haunted him, the strange weight hanging from it, the lifeless ring around its base. He opened his journal and began to write, his letters slow and deliberate. Observed anomaly at 22°07 S 16°49. E. Structure possibly avian. Scale beyond known norms. Area acoustically dead. no insect chorus, soil desiccated, returning for direct inspection tomorrow, and log. He closed the notebook and leaned back, letting the chair creak beneath him. The night outside was utterly still. Not a single insect clung to the window screen. Even the stars, bright and endless, seemed further away than usual. He wondered, as he often did, if the land could remember. Perhaps the silence of that northern patch was not emptiness, but memory, something that had settled into the soil long ago and waited. When he finally lay down, he kept his boots by the door and the radio turned on low volume, listening to the static. It comforted him in a strange way, the faint human noise in a world that had none. Sleep came late, slow and heavy. Before dawn, he awoke to the call of a distant owl. The air was cold, and the wind had shifted again, this time almost whispering. He could taste dust on his tongue. Outside, the eastern horizon began to brighten. He packed his gear carefully: rope, camera, water, compass, a small medical kit, and his drone. He added a coil of climbing line, though he wasn't sure why, perhaps out of intuition. When the sun broke over the plain, he started the truck and drove toward the north, toward the tree that waited alone in the silence. As the road fell behind him, he glanced once in the rearview mirror. The cabin was shrinking into a dot, swallowed by light. Ahead lay a stretch of wilderness that had forgotten the sound of life. Somewhere within that expanse stood a tree too heavy for its own branches, carrying something unknown. The ranger pressed on, following a promise he could not yet name, into the place where silence ruled. And with each mile the air grew stiller, the colors duller, and the thin horizon began to shimmer like a mirage, as if the land itself was holding its breath. That was how his journey into the Forbidden Zone began. The day Ranger Jalen Brooks drove north toward the tree that would change the way he understood the wilderness forever. The road dissolved into gravel and dust long before the sun reached its full height. Jalen Brooks drove north, his hands steady on the wheel, eyes flicking between the horizon and the small GPS unit mounted on the dashboard. The coordinates he had written in his notebook the night before guided him onward, deeper into the section of the reserve that most rangers ignored. There was no official policy banning the northern flats, but everyone knew that area was better left alone. Over the years, it had grown a quiet reputation for swallowing things: animals, equipment, even sound itself. He left before sunrise, but already the air shimmered with heat. The sun climbed fast here, burning away to thin morning mist until every stone gleamed. A hum of insects grew and faded in irregular bursts. Jalen rolled down his window, but the wind that entered was as warm as breath. He tasted dust, felt grit on his teeth. His truck rattled over the corrugated road, suspension creaking with each rise and dip. Somewhere behind him, the last trace of civilization, the ranger station, vanished into the distance. Ahead stretched only ochre soil and the faint mirage of heat-hazed air. He drove until the road ended at a dry riverbed, its banks fringed with brittle shrubs. Parking under the shade of a camel-thorn tree, he killed the engine and sat in silence for a moment. The ticking of the cooling metal seemed loud against the emptiness. He could feel that strange stillness again, a kind of pressure that wasn't sound but absence of it. He stepped out, and the silence thickened, swallowing the crunch of his boots before it could echo. Even the flies, relentless everywhere else, avoided this patch of earth. The air smelled faintly of rust. He reached for his binoculars, raised them toward the horizon, and found the tree he had seen the day before. It stood alone, a twisted shape framed against the pale sky, its trunk dark with age. Around it, the ground looked scorched, not blackened by fire, but stripped bare of grass and life. The enormous structure in its branches was unmistakable now. It bulged and sagged, a massive, woven mass of dry grass, sticks, and debris, glinting in places where the sun hit fragments of metal and plastic. It didn't look built by accident. It looked deliberate, layered over generations. He should have been awed, but instead, a faint unease prickled under his skin. The tree's presence felt intrusive, wrong in some subtle way, as if the land itself had been forced to accept it. He noted the GPS coordinates again, double-checking them before securing his gear. Water bottle, climbing rope, camera, notebook, a small handheld anemometer for wind readings, and his drone, tucked neatly into a side compartment. He started walking. The landscape was a study in monotony. Red soil broken by patches of gray brush, stones bleached white by the sun, the occasional termite mound rising like a relic. As he advanced, he noticed details he hadn't seen before. The ground was oddly uneven, scattered with shallow depressions that formed a faint spiral pattern leading toward the center where the tree stood. In some of the depressions, the soil had hardened into a crust. He knelt, scraped a sample into a vial. The texture wasn't normal sand. It had fused, as if exposed to extreme heat or chemicals long ago. He rose and walked on. The closer he got, the heavier the air felt, as if the atmosphere thickened. Even breathing demanded effort. He scanned the sky. No birds. Usually, a tree of that size would attract life. Hornbills, doves, maybe even an owl's roost. But the branches were bare except for the colossal nest. It hung low in some places, touching the lower limbs like a curtain. The woven material shifted slightly in the wind, making a faint rasping sound. As he approached the perimeter, he noticed something else. Tracks. Not animal, not fresh, but human. A line of boot prints crossed the dry soil from the south and ended a few meters from the base of the tree. He crouched beside one, measuring it by eye. Size 10, perhaps. Deep impressions. Whoever had stood here carried weight or a heavy pack. There were two distinct patterns, meaning at least two people had been here recently. He followed them a short distance and found more signs. A cigarette butt, crushed and half buried in dust. A torn scrap of plastic packaging, the kind used for dried meat or jerky. The wind hadn't erased them yet, so the visit must have been within the last week. Jalen straightened slowly, scanning the open plain around him. Nothing moved. The light was sharp, hard-edged. He had the unpleasant sensation of being watched, though he knew there was no one in sight. The air carried no sound except the faint rattle of dry grass. He walked a slow circle around the tree, studying it from every angle. Up close, the nest's texture was even stranger. Interwoven layers of grass, straw, plastic ribbons, even strands of wire. It gleamed faintly, as if metallic threads ran through it. The structure was huge, easily the size of a small house, extending over half the canopy. The lower sections sagged, creating what looked like tunnels and pockets. Some hung so low they almost touched his shoulders. He reached out to touch a loose strand. The material was warm, almost unnaturally so, as if it retained heat from inside. When he let go, it vibrated faintly. He stepped back, uneasy. Circling to the northern side, he found something else. At the base of the trunk, the earth was marked by faint parallel lines, the kind made by dragon equipment. Near them, half buried in the dirt, was a small metal object glinting dully in the light. He knelt and brushed the dust away. It was a cartridge casing, flattened by weight, but unmistakable. He turned it over in his palm. A small caliber, probably .22, a shot had been fired here. He pocketed the casing and stood, wiping his hand on his pants. Whoever had come before him hadn't been studying birds. They had been hunting or testing something. He didn't like the implications. The local poachers used larger calibers for antelope. A .22 was for precision, small targets, or warning shots. Jalen took a few steps back to look at the tree again. The branches at the upper crown seemed to tremble, though the air was still. Perhaps wind at higher altitude, he thought, but the motion was rhythmic, not random. He raised his binoculars and focused on a small section near the center of the nest. The surface there seemed to pulse, a subtle expansion and contraction, like the rise and fall of breath. He blinked, adjusted the focus again, but the movement stopped. The image steadied into stillness. He lowered the binoculars, exhaled slowly. The heat was dizzying now, wrapping the land in shimmering layers. He drank from his canteen, the water tepid but refreshing. His instincts told him not to linger too long without first marking an escape route. He studied the surrounding terrain, choosing landmarks, a line of stones, a dry termite mound, the angle of the sun. By early afternoon, the temperature soared beyond 40 degrees Celsius. The tree stood as a black silhouette against the glare, the nest a strange, unnatural halo. He took out his drone and launched it, watching as it climbed into the sky, the propellers slicing the still air. On the small screen, the landscape unfolded in muted colors. Tan earth, scattered shrubs, and in the center, the great tree casting an irregular shadow. He guided the drone higher and circled above the crown. From this height, the structure's complexity became clear. It wasn't one nest, but dozens, interlocked, fused together, forming a lattice of chambers and passageways. In the sun, metallic fragments winked like eyes. He recorded footage, zooming in on the darker regions near the trunk. Heat signatures flickered faintly there, small but distinct. The readings suggested that the interior of the structure was significantly cooler than the outside air, which made no sense. Natural nests didn't regulate temperature so precisely. He brought the drone down, heart beating faster. There was an intelligence to this architecture, or at least a purpose beyond instinct. Yet his training cautioned him. Nature often appeared intentional when it was merely efficient. Still, he could not ignore the sense that this was more than adaptation. It was design. As he packed his equipment, he caught another detail. Beneath a low-hanging fringe of the nest, the ground bore tiny, circular indentations, not footprints, but something smaller, patterned like a honeycomb pressed into the soil. They radiated outward before fading. He touched one gently with his fingertips. It was firm, almost baked into the ground. He photographed them, then glanced again at the tree. The shadows had lengthened. A low wind picked up, carrying the scent of dry minerals and something faintly organic, almost sweet. The sound that came from the branches was unlike the whisper of leaves. It was a soft, irregular rustle, as though many small bodies shifted deep within the nest. A sudden sense of trespass swept over him. The urge to retreat, to give the place its silence back, was almost physical. He stepped back slowly, eyes fixed on the tree, until he reached the small rise where his truck waited. The wind died again the moment he crossed a certain line, as if the boundary of the quiet zone had a mind of its own. He climbed into the cab and closed the door, breathing hard without realizing it. The air inside felt lighter. For several minutes he sat there, motionless, watching through the windshield. The tree didn't move, didn't change, yet he couldn't shake the impression that it was listening. When he finally started the engine, the sound of combustion startled him in the stillness. He turned the truck around and drove slowly south, leaving a thin trail of dust behind. The world seemed to wake up again with each kilometer. The chirp of insects returned, a pair of guinea fowl darted across the road, the ordinary life of the savannah resumed. But even as he reached the first familiar signs of normal terrain, he couldn't dispel the memory of that dead silence, of the massive, woven structure looming over the barren ground. It felt less like a nest and more like a monument, something built not merely to live in, but to remember. When the ranger station came into view, the sun was setting, staining the horizon a deep red. Jalen parked, shut off the engine, and sat for a long while without moving. The hum of cicadas surrounded him now, the world noisy again, as if to compensate for what he had left behind. He took out his notebook and began to write his field report, hands trembling slightly as he shaped the words. Second approach successful. Structure confirmed avian but exceeds known communal dimensions. Human presence detected. Tracks, spent cartridge. Internal activity recorded via drone. Area acoustically suppressed. No explanation consistent with known environmental patterns. Recommend further observation at dawn. He paused, tapping the pen against the page. His handwriting was steady, but something in the words unsettled him. He closed the book and looked out at the darkness gathering beyond the window. Somewhere out there, the tree waited in its circle of silence, holding its breath under a sky full of indifferent stars. When he lay down that night, he dreamed of woven walls closing over him, of air that grew thicker with every breath. And when he woke before dawn, heart pounding, he knew he would go back. He had seen enough to be afraid, but not enough to understand. The night after, Jalen's return from the northern flats brought no rest. The heat clung to his skin even in darkness, and each time he closed his eyes, he saw that massive tree looming out of the haze like something half alive, half constructed. He had dreamed of walking beneath it again, his boots sinking into dry soil that breathed faintly, pulsing like the skin of an animal. When he awoke before dawn, his shirt was damp with sweat, and the air inside the cabin hung still and heavy. The silence he had left behind at the tree seemed to have followed him home. He brewed coffee, as he always did, letting the metallic kettle whistle weakly over the gas flame. The familiar, bitter smell grounded him. Outside, the first light was soft and gray, spreading across the land with deceptive calm. The world beyond the window looked ordinary, the sweep of yellow grass, the silhouettes of thorn trees, the distant line of the hills. But he could not shake the sense that something had shifted. The morning no longer felt neutral, it felt watchful. He studied his field notes again. The phrases he had written the night before, acoustically suppressed, human presence detected, internal activity recorded, looked foreign now, as if written by someone else. He found himself rereading them, doubting his own observation, then growing angry at the thought of doubting what he knew he had seen. A structure that size, with heat differentials and rhythmic motion, could not be dismissed as ordinary bird behavior. And yet, what else could it be? By the time the sun cleared the horizon, he had made his decision. He packed his gear for a full-day survey, extra water, rope, spare batteries, 2 cameras, and the small notebook he never went without. He left the rifle in its case under the cot. He had learned years ago that fear armed with a weapon became something reckless. What he needed today was patience, not power. The drive back to the northern zone felt shorter than it had the previous morning. though perhaps it was because his focus had narrowed to a single point on the horizon. He knew the route now: the dry riverbed, the line of low dunes, the wind-twisted shrubs that marked the edge of the silence. As he approached the boundary, the hum of insects around his truck faded one by one, until the world slipped once again into that muffled quiet. The steering wheel vibrated faintly beneath his hands, but the sound of the engine seemed swallowed by the air. He parked in the same place beneath the same lonely thorn tree and stepped out. The heat was already rising, though it was not yet mid-morning. He stood for a moment beside the truck, eyes closed, listening. Nothing. The emptiness pressed at his eardrums until it almost rang. Then, faintly, he heard it, a low, steady sigh, as if the earth exhaled somewhere in the distance. He opened his eyes and looked towards the tree. It seemed larger than before. Perhaps the heat distorted his sense of scale, or perhaps he was simply seeing it with the full weight of knowing now. The crown of woven grass shimmered faintly, and the air above it trembled with refracted light. Around its base, the soil was cracked and gray, forming concentric rings that looked almost deliberate, like scars that had healed over time. Jalen began walking toward it, one careful step after another. His boot sank slightly in the brittle crust. He felt a strange resistance in the ground beneath each footfall, as though something fibrous ran just below the surface. The closer he got, the stronger the smell became, a mixture of dust, dry vegetation, and something faintly sweet, almost resinous, like sap left too long in the sun. When he reached the tree, he set his pack down and circled slowly, taking photographs from different angles. Through the lens, the nest looked like a living organism, fibers glinting, shadows forming dark tunnels, surfaces layered in chaotic precision. Here and there, pieces of man-made material caught the light. Thin wires, faded bits of cloth, a strip of copper foil, even what looked like fragments of an old solar panel embedded in the weave. It was impossible to tell where the natural ended and the artificial began. He crouched and pressed his hand against the trunk. The bark was rough and dry, but warm, not just from the sun. The temperature was uneven, with patches of heat and coolness that seemed to pulse in intervals. He withdrew his hand quickly, his heart hammering faster than he expected. Then he steadied himself, drew a deep breath, and continued examining the perimeter. Beneath the lower edge of the nest, the earth was scattered with debris, broken shells, bird droppings, and small pellets of compacted grass. But mixed among them were other things: the dried remains of insects, pieces of animal fur, and, disturbingly, what looked like small bones. He picked one up carefully. It was hollow, brittle, likely avian, but its surface was faintly discolored as if from mineral exposure. He dropped it and wiped his fingers on his pants. Jalen stood back and tilted his head upward, tracing the pattern of the tunnels that hung like thick ropes along the underside of the nest. The architecture was complex, more intricate than anything instinct alone could explain. The openings weren't random. They followed a pattern of ascending spirals, each connecting to the next in a precise rhythm. He wondered how many generations of birds had built this fortress, how long it had taken for nature to become indistinguishable from intention. He stepped closer, peering into one of the lower cavities. The interior was dark, but as his eyes adjusted, he could make out faint glimmers, like the reflections of tiny eyes, or perhaps the sheen of moisture. He moved back slowly, unwilling to disturb whatever might live inside. Yet he felt it again, that faint vibration beneath his feet, rhythmic and subtle, as though the tree itself possessed a heartbeat. He turned on his small environmental recorder and placed it at the base of the trunk. The device measured temperature, sound, and vibration over time. He wanted evidence, something tangible that could tell him whether this phenomenon was natural or something else entirely. Then he sat down in the shade, pulled out his notebook, and began to sketch. The stillness was absolute. Even his pencil made too much noise as it dragged across the paper. He paused, listening, and thought he heard a faint rustling overhead. He glanced up. The upper branches were trembling, though there was no wind. A shadow moved briefly across one of the openings in the nest. For an instant, he thought he saw a beak, long, thin, almost translucent, but when he blinked it was gone. He swallowed hard, feeling foolish for letting imagination play tricks on him. He had spent too many years in the field to be rattled by shadows. Yet, his body betrayed him. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the heat he had long grown used to. He reminded himself of the fundamentals: document, observe, remain objective. The wilderness rewarded patience, not panic. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, and the land around him shimmered in waves of white light. The recorder's display showed minor fluctuations in temperature: cooler near the nest's base, warmer at the top. That alone was unusual. A structure of woven material should not be capable of regulating internal climate. But here it was, defying every pattern he knew. By midday, the air grew oppressive. He drank from his canteen, then rose to take a few final measurements before retreating to the truck for shade. But as he turned, something glinted near the base of the tree. He knelt and brushed away dust. There, wedged between two roots, was a length of wire. It looked old, weathered, and brittle, but unmistakably shaped by human hands. Following it with his eyes, he saw it disappear into the mass of the nest itself. He hesitated only a moment before pulling his gloves on. Carefully, he tugged at the wire. It resisted, then gave slightly, vanishing deeper into the weave. He followed it for a short distance, tracing it around the trunk. When he reached the far side, he stopped dead. The wire was connected to a small metal box half buried in dirt, its surface corroded but its shape still clear. A control unit of some kind, military in design, maybe decades old. The faded, stenciled letters were barely visible, but he could make out the remnants of a serial number and the outline of a warning label. Jalen stared at it for a long moment. His first thought was disbelief. His second was a grim recognition. He remembered the old stories the senior rangers used to tell, the ones about the government tests during the 1970s, when sections of the Namib were used for fuel trials and chemical experiments. Most of those programs had been shut down or buried under bureaucracy, their traces erased. But perhaps not entirely. He photographed the box, marked its position in his notes, and then carefully reburied it. Whatever it had once been connected to, it was part of this place now, fused into the ecosystem like a scar under skin. He stepped back, looking at the tree anew. The fragments of metal woven into the nest, the unnatural heat variations, even the strange pattern of silence. All of it might be remnants of that history, transformed by time into something self-sustaining. The idea fascinated and unsettled him in equal measure. Nature, left alone, always found balance. But what happened when the artificial became part of that balance? When the boundaries between creation and contamination dissolved so completely that the result was neither one nor the other. He sat again beneath the tree, staring up into the heavy canopy. The sunlight filtered through in thin ribbons, painting gold stripes across the rough bark. For a moment, It was beautiful. The branches creaked faintly, like old timbers in a house. He felt the impulse to climb to see what was hidden in the deeper layers of the nest, but he stopped himself. It was too late in the day and exhaustion was setting in. Better to return tomorrow, prepared for a full ascent. Before leaving, he checked the recorder one last time. The device had captured several brief bursts of low-frequency vibration, too regular to be mere wind. He switched it off, pocketed it, and stood. The air felt heavier now, the sweetness stronger, as if the tree exhaled the scent itself. He picked up his pack and began to walk back toward the truck. Halfway there, he paused. The silence behind him seemed to deepen, pulling at him like a held breath. He turned slowly, eyes fixed on the massive nest. The light had shifted. The structure glowed faintly, its surface alive with flickering shadows. For a second, he thought he saw movement again. A ripple, a shudder running through the fibers from one end to the other. Then it was gone, leaving only stillness. He stood motionless for several heartbeats, unsure if he had imagined it. The land was too quiet for hallucinations. Slowly, he backed away until he felt the first whisper of normal air on his skin, the moment when the silence of the zone released him. He turned, climbed into the truck, and started the engine. The drive back was long and lonely. The savanna unfolded in waves of fading gold, and the sun sank behind him, leaving streaks of red across the horizon. He felt drained, emptied by the encounter, yet a strange anticipation grew within him. Tomorrow he would return. Tomorrow he would climb. That night, back in his cabin, he replayed the drone footage and zoomed in on the upper layers of the nest. The image was grainy, but the shape was unmistakable. Small, circular openings arranged in a spiral around the central trunk, like windows in a living tower. In one frame, for the briefest instant, something luminous glinted from within. A reflection or a glow, he couldn't tell. He sat long after midnight, watching that frame over and over until his eyes ached. Then he closed the laptop, stepped outside, and looked north. The horizon was dark, but he could almost feel where the tree stood, a presence pressing against the night. He realized then that sleep would not come easily again. The wilderness had revealed a secret, and it would not let him rest until he understood it. The sun fell quickly in that part of the desert, sinking behind the low ridges like a stone disappearing into deep water. By the time Jalen finished securing his equipment for the night, a dull orange glow had faded into violet, and the first cool breath of evening whispered across the plain. He sat beside his truck, the old engine clicking softly as it cooled, and looked toward the north where he knew the great tree waited. Even from this distance, he could sense its presence. The silence that had surrounded it earlier in the day seemed to have spread outward, thinning the natural sounds of the savanna until they were little more than distant murmurs. He prepared his small camp deliberately, each movement methodical, almost ritualistic. He cleared a patch of ground, set up his compact tent, and built a low fire of dry branches, feeding it sparingly so that it made little smoke. He wasn't sure whether he feared drawing attention from animals or from something else entirely. As the darkness thickened, the horizon began to blur, and the stars emerged sharp and close, as if the sky itself leaned nearer to watch. The air carried a faint electrical tension, the kind that precedes a storm, though the sky was clear. Jalen adjusted the small field camera he had mounted on a tripod facing the tree. His night vision lens would record whatever might move out there while he slept, or tried to. He also set 2 motion sensors at a distance, their tiny indicator lights blinking red before vanishing into the gloom. When everything was ready, he sat cross-legged by the fire and wrote in his notebook, the pen scratching softly over the paper. He described the patterns he had seen that day: the spiral in architecture, the embedded wire, the metal box. He noted the rhythmic vibrations the recorder had captured, the faint, pulsing heat. But when he reached the part about the sound, the sigh he thought he had heard earlier, his hand faltered. It was hard to explain something that wasn't sound, but the memory of sound, a presence felt through the skin more than through the ear. He paused, stared at the blank page, and finally wrote only one line: "The tree breathes." Then he closed the notebook. By full dark, the temperature had dropped sharply. The fire gave off a dim halo of warmth, but beyond it the night pressed close and cold. The smell of dust mixed with smoke and the faint, sweet scent that drifted from the north, the same resinous odor that had hung around the base of the tree. It came and went with the wind, subtle and persistent. Jalen sipped from his canteen and listened. Somewhere, far off, a jackal barked. Then another answered, their voices breaking the stillness for a moment before fading into silence again. The hours passed slowly. The stars rotated overhead, and the moon, thin as a blade, climbed halfway across the sky. The tree stood a dark silhouette in the distance, its crown heavy and unmoving. Yet, every now and then, Jalen thought he saw a shift in its outline, a faint quiver as though the branches flexed with the rhythm of invisible breath. He told himself it was the trick of moonlight and exhaustion, but his eyes kept returning to it. Near midnight, a new sound joined the quiet, a soft rustling like the brushing of many wings or the movement of dry leaves. He looked towards the tree and saw faint motes of light drifting from it, glowing and fading as they rose into the air. They looked like fireflies, but their movement was slower, more deliberate. He reached for his binoculars and focused. The lights hovered around the lowest edge of the nest, then vanished into its folds. He watched for several minutes, his pulse quickening, before the darkness swallowed them completely. He turned his gaze back to the plain. The silence returned, heavier than before. It was so complete that he could hear his own heartbeat in his ears. He adjusted the camera again and checked the small monitor. The tree appeared as a grainy outline, black against gray. No movement. He exhaled slowly, but the feeling of being observed grew stronger. He tried to focus on the mundane details of camp, the slow crackle of the fire, the faint ticking of metal, but they no longer grounded him. Every sound, even his own breathing, seemed foreign, as if the desert had stopped recognizing him as part of it. He forced himself to lie down inside the tent, though he left the flap open. The night air was cold enough that his breath formed faint clouds. He closed his eyes and listened to the rhythm of his breathing, trying to match it to something steady. After a while, he must have drifted into a half-sleep, because the next thing he knew, he was awake again, heart pounding, with no memory of what had woken him. The fire had burned low, casting long, wavering shadows across the sand. The camera's monitor still glowed faintly near the edge of the tent. Jalen crawled toward it, rubbed his eyes, and focused on the image. The tree was moving. Not violently, but in slow, undulating waves. The nest seemed to shift and settle, like an immense animal turning in its sleep. The branches swayed slightly, though the air outside was still. He leaned closer to the screen, unwilling to blink. The movement continued for a minute, maybe 2, then stopped altogether. He replayed the footage to make sure it wasn't a malfunction, But the pattern was there, distinct, rhythmic. Something within that structure was alive, or perhaps the structure itself was. Jalen stepped outside the tent, camera in hand. The night hit him like cold water. He turned off his flashlight and let his eyes adjust. The plain stretched before him, a vast sea of darkness punctuated by the faint silhouette of the tree. The air smelled strongly now of that same sweet, earthy scent. He took a slow step forward, then another, until he stood at the edge of his camp's light. He could hear it now, a distant whisper, almost below the threshold of hearing, like wind moving through hollow wood. It was coming from the direction of the tree. He hesitated. Every instinct told him to stay where he was, to wait until morning when light would strip the night of its illusions. But curiosity, that old and dangerous companion, pushed him onward. He took up his flashlight, dimmed it to its lowest setting, and began to walk. The distance to the tree felt longer at night. The horizon vanished, leaving only the cold stars and the faint shimmer of sand beneath his boots. His breath formed clouds that drifted behind him. Each step seemed louder than the last. After a while, he realized that the whispering had grown louder too, though he still couldn't tell if it was truly sound or just vibration traveling through the ground. When he finally reached the edge of the barren ring that surrounded the tree, he stopped. The air here was thick, warm, almost humid despite the desert cold. The scent was overwhelming now, sweet, decaying, alive. He lifted his flashlight and aimed the narrow beam upward. The massive tangle of the nest glowed dull gold under the light, fibers shimmering like muscle tissue. For an instant, he thought he saw movement inside, a slow, rippling contraction that traveled from one side to the other. He lowered the light quickly, breath caught in his throat. He stood frozen, torn between awe and terror. The world around him seemed to hold still, waiting. Then, from somewhere deep within the tree, a faint, rhythmic sound began. It was not a voice, not quite. It was the slow inhaling and exhaling of air, steady and deliberate, like the breath of something vast and ancient. The sound vibrated through the soles of his boots, up into his bones. He could feel it more than hear it. For several minutes, he could do nothing but stand there, transfixed. The tree was alive, alive in a way that defied every classification, every instinct. It was not just hosting life, it was life. Whether born of nature, mutation, or some forgotten human interference, it had become its own being. At last, a flicker of rational thought returned. He switched off the flashlight and stepped back slowly, one careful pace at a time, until the sound began to fade. He didn't turn his back until he reached the faint line where the silence ended and the world resumed its ordinary night noises, the distant cry of a jackal, the low chirping of insects. Only then did he allow himself to breathe deeply. Back at camp, his hands shook as he rewound the camera footage. The device had captured part of what he'd seen, the faint motion of the branches, the shifting of light within the nest, and the subtle distortion in the audio, a low-frequency hum that matched the rhythm he'd felt through the ground. He played it again and again, unable to look away. He recorded a brief voice note for his field log, though his voice trembled slightly. He described the phenomenon as best he could: temperature rise, acoustic anomalies, possible biothermal patterns. But even as he spoke, he knew no scientific language could express what he had witnessed. He ended the recording abruptly and switched off the device. The rest of the night passed without sleep. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw the tree moving in the darkness, its massive nest breathing like a lung. He thought about the wire he had found, the old control box buried near the roots. If some experiment had once taken place here, perhaps it had never truly ended. Perhaps nature had absorbed it, twisted it, and grown something new around its remains. When the first light of dawn broke, painting the sky in pale gray, he rose and doused the fire. The world looked fragile again, clean and almost innocent. The tree stood motionless in the distance, nothing more than a dark silhouette against the morning haze. If not for the evidence on his camera, he might have doubted everything. He packed his gear in silence, his thoughts heavy and unfocused. He knew he would return again. There was no choice now. Whatever the tree was, it was not done revealing itself. And he, whether out of duty or obsession, could not walk away. As he climbed into his truck and started the engine, the hum of machinery sounded strangely alive, echoing faintly, like that low, breathing pulse he had heard in the night. He drove south toward the ranger station, the morning sun climbing behind him, his shadow stretching long and thin across the sand. In the rearview mirror, the tree remained visible far longer than it should have, its crown glinting briefly before the light swallowed it. And for a fleeting moment, Jalen thought he saw it move again. Not a tremor of branches this time, but a slow, deliberate sway, as if it were watching him go. By the time Jalen reached the station that morning, the sun was already high, casting short, hard shadows across the yard. The air was still, as though the world held its breath. The old wooden gate creaked as he pushed it open, and the familiar sounds of the outpost, buzzing flies, the distant call of guinea fowl, the ticking of cooling metal, seemed curiously subdued. Everything felt a shade dimmer, as though the colors of the desert had drained overnight. His boots struck the dry dirt with a muffled thud, and each step felt like a sound swallowed before it was truly born. He moved with the automatic precision of habit, unloading gear from the truck, placing each item on the wooden bench outside his cabin. He didn't bother unpacking his overnight kit. He wouldn't be staying long. The footage from the night before still ran in his mind in endless loops, the gentle ripple through the branches, the slow rhythmic movement of the nest's walls, the pulsing vibration that had entered his body like a second heartbeat. He needed answers now, not theories, not speculations, but direct observation. Inside the cabin, the laptop sat where he had left it, lid open, screen dark. He tapped the trackpad, and the image bloomed again. The night vision feed frozen at a single frame. The nest's outer layer rippled under the pale infrared lens, edges glowing faintly. He zoomed in. The structure appeared porous, its woven strands forming what looked like passageways. Something small moved within the frame, darting from one opening to another. It was too fast for a clear image, but its outline was distinct. A narrow body, long limbs or wings folded tightly, movement too fluid to be mechanical, too precise to be purely animal. Jalen exhaled slowly and clicked the lid shut. It was time. Today he would climb the tree. Whatever this was, whether a mutation of nature, a legacy of human interference, or some as yet unseen cooperative miracle, it demanded witness from within. And he could no longer stand to remain at the edge, peering in. He packed lightly but thoroughly. Rope harness, climbing gloves, helmet, flashlight, spare batteries, his smallest recording device, and a pouch with labeled sample containers. He double-checked every knot and seam, then checked them again. His movements were meticulous, not out of fear, but from the understanding that what he was about to do had never been done before. Not here, not with this. By midday, he was back at the edge of the silent zone. The insects had vanished again as he approached. The wind died down until not even the grass bent. The moment he crossed into the ring of stillness, the weight of the air pressed against his skin like damp wool. The truck's engine stuttered as he turned it off, the silence swallowing the final sputter like a closing door. He walked the last few hundred meters on foot, the rope coiled around his torso, the climbing rig jangling softly at his side. The tree rose ahead of him, massive and silent, its shadow a dense island on the flat plain. The woven mass around its crown seemed heavier than before. In the daylight, it took on an amber hue, and the embedded materials, wire, fragments of metal, bits of cloth, flashed in the sun like veins of ore. Jalen paused at the base, looking up, eyes following the curve of the structure. He chose the southern side for his ascent, where the lower limbs were thick and angled like ladder rungs. The bark was cracked and rough, but strong. He anchored his first rope loop, tested it with his full weight, then began to climb. Each meter revealed new details. The outer layer of the nest was composed of tightly braided fibers, mostly grass, but reinforced in places with strips of plastic, lengths of copper, even old shoelaces. It was as if the builders had scavenged every possible material from the land around them. He passed a bundle of what looked like dried moss fused with fishing line, and another section stitched with thin strands of animal fur. The engineering was complex, adaptive, and deeply intentional. Higher up, the scent intensified, a mix of dry rot, earth, and something sweetly organic, like tree sap left in the sun too long. It wasn't unpleasant, but it was strong. He paused, catching his breath, wiping sweat from his forehead. The temperature had dropped noticeably. Though the sun beat down from above, the air around the nest was markedly cooler. He checked his portable thermometer, several degrees lower than ambient. The structure wasn't just insulating itself, it was regulating heat. He reached the first cavity about 6 meters up. It yawned open like a tunnel entrance, surrounded by a fringe of longer grasses. The inside was dark, but not pitch black. The walls glowed faintly from within, lit by scattered flecks of some reflective substance embedded in the weave. He switched on his headlamp and crawled in. The tunnel narrowed quickly, forcing him to slide on elbows and knees. The smell inside was richer, thicker. The air tasted of old wood and something else, damp like a riverbank after rain. As he moved forward, the interior opened into a chamber, roughly spherical, with a vaulted ceiling made entirely of interlocked grasses and flexible twigs. The light from his headlamp caught the glint of dozens of small, pale filaments crisscrossing the space like nerve fibers. The floor was covered in a dense mat of soft material, almost sponge-like. He touched it with gloved fingers. It compressed easily and sprang back slowly, retaining no debris. A perfect natural cushion, absorbent and elastic. He scanned the walls. Several smaller tunnels branched off in different directions, each marked by a distinct pattern in the weave, as if color-coded, but with texture and shape instead of hue. Jalen set the recorder down and began to speak softly into the mic, describing what he saw. His voice sounded muffled in the chamber, as though the structure absorbed sound as well as light. He ran a small airflow test. The results were startling. Gentle currents moved through the chamber in a circular pattern, up through one tunnel and down another. The nest was ventilated. More than that, it breathed. He explored further, following a passage that sloped gently upward. Here, the walls grew warmer again. The fibers were tighter, the materials more varied. He found feathers, bits of bone, even a twisted shard of glass, woven in, not discarded. Each piece served a purpose, though he could not guess them all. The balance was too elegant for randomness. The next chamber was larger, domed like a cathedral, the ceiling lost in shadow. It was not empty. Along the curved wall, nestled in pockets, were dozens of creatures. At first, he thought them birds, small, hunched forms wrapped in feather and fluff. But as he watched, he realized they were not all of the same species. Some resembled rodents, others small lizards, a few insects the size of a child's thumb. All were still, breathing, yes, but barely. Their bodies twitched in unison at intervals as if sinking to a rhythm deeper than sleep. Jalen held his breath. He had seen hibernation patterns before, but this was different. These creatures weren't asleep in isolation. They were linked, tied together by something unseen. A communal state of rest, a shared biological frequency. He didn't know. He only knew that the air vibrated faintly in his lungs. He backed out slowly, careful not to disturb anything. As he moved down a new tunnel, he saw other chambers, each with its own configuration. Storage spaces, nesting areas, even what looked like refuse pits lined with a calcified shell. The design was not just complex. It was purposeful, modular, evolving. He stopped to rest in a smaller node where the ceiling dipped low. The walls pulsed faintly with light, the glow soft and golden. He closed his eyes for a moment, overwhelmed by the strange calmness of the place. Time slipped. When he opened them again, he wasn't sure how long he'd sat there. A distant vibration rippled through the walls. Not threatening, not loud, but unmistakable. A signal of some kind. Communication. The builders, whoever or whatever they were, had a system. Jalen knew then that this place had outgrown its origins. Whether born from birds, altered by environmental change, or seeded by past experiments, it had become something new. An ecosystem, yes, but more than that, a living structure with intent, with rules, with awareness. He turned to leave, retracing his path. As he moved, the tunnels seemed to adjust around him, fibers shifting slightly to accommodate his passage. The way was never blocked, yet never fully open. As if the structure acknowledged his presence and allowed it, this time. When he finally emerged into daylight, blinking against the sun, the silence outside felt sharper, like a blade across the skin. He unclipped his harness, lowered himself carefully, and stepped away from the trunk. The tree stood unchanged, silent, unmoving. Yet, as he looked back one final time before returning to his truck, he saw a small movement at the very top of the nest. A flutter, a brief tilt, like a curtain drawn back and replaced. It had seen him. He did not speak on the way back. The truck rumbled over the sand, each bump a steady rhythm that lulled his body but not his mind. Behind his eyes the nest still glowed. In his chest the pulse of its breath echoed faintly. That night he didn't write a report. He simply sat in silence, letting the memory settle. He had gone inside. He had seen. Nothing. Not in the books, not in the maps, not in all the years of walking the wild, could explain what waited in that tree. But it was real. It was alive. And it had invited him in. Jalen didn't sleep the night after returning from the nest. He lay on the cot in the narrow shadows of his cabin, staring at the slatted ceiling, the air around him unmoving, too thick for rest. Outside, the desert breathed with slow heat, but inside, time had gone still. The silence that had haunted the tree now echoed in his bones. He didn't feel afraid. What settled over him now was something older than fear, an awareness that what he had touched, what he had climbed into, was not just an outlier of nature or a scientific marvel. It was a wound buried in the landscape, a deep scar that pulsed with memory, The further he moved into it, the more he realized he was not just a visitor. He was now a witness. He rose at first light and made strong coffee, though it sat untouched on the table for hours. Instead, he stood at the window with his field notebook open in one hand, eyes fixed on the horizon. The pages were filled with scrawled details: fiber composition, tunnel depth, airflow dynamics, organism symbiosis. Each observation had the sharp edge of fact, but they lacked the thing he couldn't write: context. None of it explained why this place existed. None of it answered the question that had been growing in him since he first saw the shimmering crown of that tree from his drone. What had started it? The key, he knew, had to be hidden in history. And so, as the desert brightened around him and the wind began to stir fine dust through the yard, Jalen left his field notes behind and walked to the main storage building. The old ranger office, now mostly unused, sat behind the station, a low squat structure of cracked stone and warped timber. Its lock was rusted, and the hinges groaned like old bones as he pushed the door open. Inside, the air smelled of sun-cured paper, mildew, and disuse. Stacks of metal cabinets lined the walls, each drawer labeled with faded handwriting. There were records here that went back decades, even to the colonial era. He switched on the dusty overhead bulb, but it only flickered before dying. Light slanted in through the narrow window, falling across the dust-laced air in golden shafts. Jalen moved carefully through the room, following instinct as much as logic. He began with the wildlife archives, tracing through years of reports: herd migration logs, bird counts, seasonal die-offs. Most were meticulous, handwritten in ink by men and women long gone. Nothing unusual leapt out until he reached a bundle marked Zone 4, Special Incidents, 1972-1976. The paper was brittle, almost translucent. The ink faded but legible. There were maps, familiar outlines but with notes written in shorthand, marking wells and test points he had never seen. And there, amid a half-dozen dry memoranda, he found a single typed page that stopped his breath. It was marked Internal Memo, Department of Fuel and Materials Research, Field Deployment 3.2. The date was January 1973. The subject: Evaluation of Containment Viability, following non-explosive fuel dispersal test. The location coordinates, though imprecise, pointed to the very region where the tree now stood. Jalen read it twice, 3 times. The language was clinical, bloodless. It spoke of limited dispersal of polymeric aerosols, subsurface heat mapping inconsistent with terrain normatives, and anomalous vegetative overgrowth at site periphery. At the bottom, in a different hand, was a note scribbled diagonally across the page: bird colonies increasing in structure complexity, observation pending. He stood still, paper in hand, the silence of the office pressing in. The implication was clear. Something had been released here 50 years ago. Not a weapon, but something more insidious. A dispersal, an experimental material left to integrate with the ecosystem. Not properly cleaned, not monitored past a few months. And over time the desert did what the desert always did. It absorbed, buried, transformed. But not this time. Not entirely. He turned to the next file labeled D. Van Dyke, Field Notes. The name was vaguely familiar. He had seen it in old ranger logs, probably someone stationed here long before his own time. The folder was thin. Inside were only 3 sheets, handwritten notes on torn stationery. The writing was uneven, rushed. August 1974. Colony expansion exceeds expected rate. Nesting behavior shows evidence of adaptive learning. not just accumulation, design. September 1974. Birds no longer flee on approach. Observed two separate species cohabiting shared structure without aggression. Gaps in known behavior. October 1974. Something's wrong. Found copper wire woven into base of nest. One of the junior staff went missing for 2 hours. Said he got lost in the shade. I think the structure's affecting more than the wildlife. There was no further entry, no summary, no official report. It simply ended there, as if the observer had stopped writing mid-thought or been told to stop. Jalen set the pages down, the edges curling slightly from the moisture of his fingertips. He sat in the wooden chair at the far end of the room, staring at the cabinet. The wind outside had picked up, brushing sand across the glass like dry fingers. The implications began to align in his mind. A test buried under paperwork and time. A chemical or synthetic agent intended to simulate organic resilience, likely for military or industrial purposes. The region marked for minimal ecological concern, then abandoned, and the result, decades later, was the tree, or what the tree had become. But that still didn't explain the behavior. The collective hibernation, the synchronized movement of creatures inside, the subtle awareness that had greeted him during the climb, that couldn't be explained by exposure alone. It was as if the structure had evolved beyond its origins. It wasn't simply contaminated nature, it was new nature. He gathered the files, slipped them into a field satchel, and walked back to the cabin. There, he spread them across the table alongside his own notes, placing his sketches of the tunnels beside the old memos. The resemblance was undeniable. The same spiral patterns noted in early observations were now full-fledged architectural systems. What had begun as adaptive behavior had become a stable, self-maintaining environment. He checked his messages. One signal from a fellow ranger on the southern edge of the park. Sightings of metal scrappers, men on motorbikes moving without permits, asking about that weird tree out north. Jalen's stomach tightened. Word was spreading. If outsiders reached the nest before protective measures were in place, it would be torn apart, studied, dissected, sold in pieces. He sent a short message in return. Perimeter, watch advised, potential poaching risk, site sensitive. We'll advise further. Then he sat back and thought. He had two options. File the report with the regional authorities, initiate a full environmental alert, and risk attracting the very people he most feared. Or keep the location concealed a little longer, contact the international conservation body he had worked with years ago, slow-moving but discreet, and hope they could mobilize quietly. He chose the second. That evening, as the sun bled into the western hills, he composed the most careful message of his life. No coordinates, no photos, just a summary. Discovery of a unique biome, highly integrated, potentially the result of historical contamination. He framed it as urgent but unstable, too fragile for wide exposure, too important to ignore. He requested a specialist team under sealed advisory. Then, he encrypted the message and sent it through a secure satellite line he hadn't used in years. Afterward, he walked out to the edge of the yard. The wind had died down again. The desert stretched before him, blank and endless, but he no longer saw it as empty. The land held its secrets beneath the dust, beneath the bones of old men and buried documents. And now one of those secrets had surfaced, stitched into the branches of a tree too large to be ignored. He looked north. The tree wasn't visible from here, not with the light falling and the ridges rising between, but he could feel it, the way you feel the weight of something behind a closed door. He remembered the way the tunnel walls had shimmered with breath, the warmth that radiated in pulses, the subtle shifting that welcomed his steps. He had never felt more human than when he'd crawled through that strange cathedral of silence and light. Back inside, he cleared a space on his work table and began organizing everything into a single dossier. When he reached the page from Van Dyck, the final, desperate scrawl, he paused. There was a coffee stain across one corner, a blurred word he hadn't noticed before. He held it under the lamp. The word was interface. That was the term. Not just observation, not just integration, interaction. He stared at it for a long time. The tree wasn't just alive. It was listening, maybe even learning. He leaned back in the chair, hands folded behind his head, and let his mind drift. Outside, the desert darkened into stillness. And somewhere beneath the surface of the earth, or the surface of bark and woven fiber, something stirred, as if acknowledging its name had been spoken again after too many years in silence. Dawn arrived in muted tones, the first light of the Namibian sun brushing the plains with pale gold. Jalen Brooks rose before it fully broke the horizon, moving quietly in the small cabin where shadows still clung to the corners. The night had been restless, filled with dreams of the nest, the tunnels, the rhythm of the breathing tree. He had hardly slept. Every time his eyes closed, the vast crown of woven fibers loomed before him, and he could feel the pulse of life inside it, slow and deliberate, moving in ways that defied reason. Now, in the cold clarity of morning, he knew he could no longer observe from the edge. He had to make a choice. He packed carefully, loading his harness, ropes, gloves, headlamp, spare batteries, and all the cameras into his field pack. The recorder from the night before, still humming faintly with residual energy, was placed in a protective case. He double-checked the knots on his climbing rig, each loop and carabiner secured, tested again under his full weight. The choice to return and observe had never been without risk, but today the risk felt immediate. He knew that time was not his ally. Whoever had previously discovered the nest, the poachers, the metal scavengers, the curious outsiders, would eventually return. He could see it in the tracks left near the perimeter, the faint echoes of movement in the sand, and in the faint shimmer of human presence reported by his colleagues at the southern boundary. Jalen stepped outside into the dawn, the wind stirring fine grains of sand, brushing against his face with cool insistence. The air carried the scent of the nest, the same sweet and earthy smell that had drawn him closer each day. It was heavier than usual, more insistent, like a warning he could feel in his chest. He paused at the edge of the flat, assessing the distance to the tree. The land stretched wide, the horizon broken only by low dunes and scattered thorn trees. The nest was not visible from this far, its mass hidden in the crown of the massive acacia, but he could sense its presence, an invisible weight against the calm desert. He began walking, the sand crunching faintly beneath his boots. Each step brought him deeper into the zone of silence. Birds were absent. Insects had vanished. Even the wind seemed to hesitate, leaving the plain strangely still. Jalen felt the familiar tension settle over him, the same tight coil in his chest that had grown with each visit to this place. He knew the land as he knew his own hands, and yet the presence here was different. The tree demanded respect, but also attention. Its rhythms were subtle, not threatening, but commanding in a way that set the pace of his own movements. He approached the base slowly, his gaze scanning every branch, every fringe of the woven mass. The nest glimmered faintly in the morning light, fibers shimmering gold and amber, Embedded materials, metallic threads, fragments of old plastic, copper wiring, caught the sun in short, sharp flashes. He knelt at the base, touching the bark where the first layers of weave began. The texture was rough, almost living beneath his gloves, and the warmth radiating from the lower sections of the nest confirmed what he had measured before. This structure maintained its own temperature, regulating heat and humidity with precision that no ordinary bird colony could achieve. Jalen began the ascent with deliberate care, testing each limb, each branch before committing his weight. The climb was strenuous, requiring him to balance and pull with slow, controlled movements. The fibers of the nest shifted slightly as he passed, accommodating him without resisting, yet always returning to their original form. He thought of the centuries-old acacias he had climbed in his youth, of the stability of their trunks and branches, and yet this felt different. The nest was alive, not just in the creatures it housed, but as a single, cohesive organism. It moved subtly in response to him, adjusting, breathing, reacting. As he reached the first chamber, he paused to take measurements. The air was cooler here, denser, infused with the scent of decomposed plant material and faint mineral traces. The walls were intricate, strands interwoven with intent, forming passageways and pockets. Tiny creatures, barely visible, scuttled along the surfaces, moving in perfect synchronization. Jalen recognized the patterns immediately. Each movement served a function within the chamber, coordinated with the movements of others elsewhere in the nest. He could feel the rhythm in his own chest, as if the nest's pulse were synchronizing with his heartbeat. He moved deeper, following a tunnel that rose gently. The chamber expanded into a vault of woven fibers, ceiling high enough to stand upright. The structure was modular, each section distinct in size and function. He observed storage areas for plant material, nesting chambers for birds, and separate pockets for small mammals and reptiles. The engineering was sophisticated, adaptive, and completely naturalized. Nothing within the nest was wasted. Everything had a purpose. Jalen reached a junction where several tunnels converged. The airflow here was noticeable, circulating in a precise pattern that allowed heat to rise and escape while maintaining a stable climate within the main chambers. He paused to document everything, taking photographs and notes. His hands were steady, but his mind raced. This nest was not merely a structure. It was a self-sustaining ecosystem, a living entity shaped by forces both natural and human. The embedded wires and fragments of old experimental materials he had found previously were integrated seamlessly into the structure, as if the nest had absorbed them and learned to work with them. It was more than adaptation. It was intelligence manifest in form. A subtle vibration ran through the walls, perceptible through his gloves. It pulsed in a slow, steady rhythm like a heartbeat. Jalen froze, listening. The creatures within the nest paused their movements, responding to the pulse, shifting in unison. It was not a sound he could hear, but a resonance he could feel in his chest. The realization hit him fully. The nest was alive in a way that transcended individual species. It was an organism of many forms, a collective consciousness bound by structure, rhythm, and space. He continued, moving carefully through one of the side passages. Here, the temperature fluctuated slightly, warmer near the top, cooler near the base. Light filtered through the fibers in irregular patterns, creating shifting shadows that danced across the walls. Jalen realized that the nest was not just controlling airflow, it was modulating light and temperature simultaneously, creating microenvironments tailored to the needs of its occupants. The complexity was staggering. This was a living architecture, evolving over decades, shaped by instinct, opportunity, and necessity. He reached a chamber where the walls expanded into a dome. The floor was covered with soft, interwoven fibers that formed a natural mat, cushioning movement and absorbing impact. Small creatures were gathered here, moving in subtle, coordinated patterns. Birds, small mammals, insects, all operating in concert. Jalen observed their behavior, noting synchronization, feeding patterns, and spatial organization. It was unlike any natural colony he had studied. This was design, purpose, balance. Hours passed as he documented every detail, the sunlight filtering through the woven layers, highlighting the astonishing complexity. He measured temperature, humidity, airflow, and structural composition, taking samples only where absolutely necessary, careful not to disturb the equilibrium. The nest responded subtly to his presence, fibers shifting, small creatures moving away, the vibrations adjusting to accommodate him. He was an intruder, yet the structure allowed him access, as if testing his intentions. By late afternoon, he began the descent. Each movement was deliberate, cautious, aware that the nest's pulse, subtle as it was, could sense disruption. As he neared the base, he stopped and touched the outer weave, feeling warmth and vibration ripple through his fingers. The nest had acknowledged him. It had allowed him to witness its interior, to understand a fraction of its complexity, and now it would return to its rhythm as he departed. Stepping back into the open air, Jalen inhaled deeply, the scent of the nest lingering in his nose. He paused, glancing up at the crown of the tree, the woven mass now glowing faintly in the golden late afternoon light. He felt both awe and a deep, profound responsibility. This was a living ecosystem unlike any other, one that had survived through secrecy, resilience, and subtle intelligence. To expose it recklessly would destroy it. To ignore it would risk losing the chance to protect and understand it. He packed his gear quickly, methodically, and began the walk back to the truck. The sun was low now, long shadows stretching across the sand. Each step felt heavier, laden with the weight of discovery and the gravity of what he had witnessed. The desert around him seemed alive with possibility, each dune and scrub tree imbued with memory. He glanced back one last time. The nest, the tree, the living architecture above him, they had observed his departure as surely as he had observed them. Driving back toward the station, the desert shimmered in the heat, mirages flickering along the horizon. Jalen's mind turned over every detail of the day, every measurement, every observation. He thought of the old reports he had read, the historical experiments, the way human interference had created the conditions for something extraordinary. The nest was more than nature, more than accident. It was a monument, a living testament to resilience, adaptation, and the unforeseen consequences of human presence. By the time he reached the cabin, the stars were beginning to emerge, pale and distant. He set his equipment down, carefully logging each detail in his notebook. He did not sleep that night. Instead, he sat by the window, looking north, listening to the soft desert wind. Somewhere beyond the ridges, the tree waited, its nest alive and breathing, holding its secrets and its rhythms. Jalen understood that his next decisions would determine whether this ecosystem survived or was lost forever. He was no longer just an observer. He was a guardian. And the choice before him would define not only his role, but the fate of the remarkable living structure he had come to know. If you enjoyed this incredible journey into the unknown, Make sure to subscribe now so you never miss the next adventure. Hit that notification bell to be the first to discover the secrets waiting in the wild. Don't stop here. Check out our other videos and see what mysteries are hiding just beyond the horizon. And if this story amazed you, share this video with your friends and let them experience it too. The next discovery could be just a click away.